My mother stood at my wedding reception with a champagne glass raised high, her face glowing with that particular smile she reserved for special moments, and said the words that would detonate my entire life. I'm so blessed to have 2 daughters, but I have to be honest, my other daughter is my pride. She was looking directly at my sister Katie when she said it, not at me, at Katie, at my wedding. I felt David's hand tighten around mine under the table, his grip almost painful, and the room went so quiet I could hear the ice melting in someone's drink 3 tables over. Guests shifted in their seats, eyes darting between me, Katie, and my mother, who just kept talking, oblivious or maybe just committed to the bit, listing off Katie's achievements like she was accepting an award on her behalf. My face was on fire, my vision tunneled. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what was happening because surely my mother hadn't just announced at my wedding that my sister was the daughter she was actually proud of. Then David leaned in close and whispered 4 words that probably saved my life. We're leaving, now. That moment, that single toast, led me to discover a 28-year lie that explained every painful, confusing, degrading moment of my childhood. It explained why I was never enough. Why Katie was always more. Why family in my house meant something completely different than what I thought it meant. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how my mother could stand up at my wedding and publicly declare her preference for my sister, you need to understand the 45 years of dysfunction that made her think that was acceptable. You need to understand what my family actually was. Spoiler alert, it wasn't what I thought. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just 1 click for you, but it means a lot to me. I need to take you back to when I was 7 and Katie was 4, because that's when I first remember noticing that something was off, though I didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. Katie got the bigger bedroom, not because she was older or needed more space, but because, as my mother explained, with that patient smile, Katie needs room to express herself, and you're so good at making do with less, Emma. I was 7. I didn't need less room, but I learned to nod and say it was fine because making a fuss meant I was being difficult, and being difficult meant disappointing Mom. And disappointing Mom meant the cold shoulder for days. Christmas morning was a production. Katie's pile of presents was always noticeably larger, wrapped more elaborately, and when I asked about it once, my mother said Katie needed extra love and I should be happy to share. I was happy to share. I was thrilled to share. I became a professional sharer. Birthdays, holidays, random Tuesdays. Katie got the new toys, the name brand clothes, the fancy art supplies. I got the practical stuff, the hand-me-downs from cousins, the "you're so mature for your age, Emma" speech that I now realize was just code for "we're not prioritizing you." My dad, Tom, watched all of this happen from behind his newspaper. He was a good man in the passive, conflict-avoidant way that makes good men useless when you actually need them. He never contradicted my mother, never stepped in when the favoritism got blatant, just gave me these sad, apologetic looks that I mistook for sympathy but were actually just guilt he wasn't willing to act on. Mom, Linda, was the conductor of this particular orchestra of dysfunction. She decided who got what, who deserved praise, who needed character building through benign neglect, and I learned very young that my role was to be the easy one. The one who understood, the responsible older sister who didn't need as much because Katie, precious Katie, needed more. I became so good at swallowing my disappointment that I forgot I was allowed to feel it at all. High school is when the pattern went from noticeable to "are you kidding me with this?" I made honor roll every semester for 4 years. My mother's response was a distracted "that's nice, honey," before turning back to help Katie with her C- book report that she'd proclaimed was too hard and unfair. I got into the state university with a partial academic scholarship. My parents congratulated me, then explained that I'd need to cover the rest myself because "You're so independent, Emma, you'll figure it out." But Katie, sweet Katie, who was still in middle school failing pre-algebra, would definitely need their full financial support when her time came. I worked 3 jobs through college. Katie's entire 4 years were paid for, plus a car, plus an apartment, plus spending money. When I graduated, my parents showed up 40 minutes late because Katie had a hair appointment that ran over, stayed for the ceremony, skipped the department reception I'd specifically invited them to, and left before dinner because they had an early morning. When Katie graduated 3 years later with a communications degree she'd never use, my parents threw a week-long celebration that included a catered backyard party, a weekend trip to the beach, and a future fund of $5,000 to help her find herself. I got a card with $50 in it. But here's the thing that really crystallized it for me: the vacations I wasn't invited to. Starting when I was 16, my parents started taking Katie on trips: Disney World, the Grand Canyon, a cruise. When I asked about coming along, my mother said someone needed to stay home and watch the house, and since I was so mature and responsible, it made sense that someone was me. I spent a week alone at 16, feeding the cat, while my family made memories without me. This happened 4 times. 4 separate vacations I was explicitly excluded from, and each time my mother made it sound like I was being given a privilege, like house-sitting was an honor instead of what it actually was: a clear message about where I ranked. My dad went along with it every time, silent and complicit, and Katie never once said, "Hey, maybe Emma should come too." Not once. I graduated college and took a job 4 states away, which my mother said was abandoning the family, but honestly felt like the first full breath I'd taken in years. I thought distance would help. It didn't. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every obligatory visit home, the same script played out with minor variations. I'd arrive with thoughtful gifts and stories about my promotions, my achievements, my life, and my mother would nod politely before turning to Katie with genuine enthusiasm to discuss her latest failed business venture or abandoned hobby. Katie went through jobs like normal people go through tissues. She'd get fired, quit dramatically, or just stop showing up, and my mother would sigh and say she's still finding her path and learning experiences are so important. Meanwhile, I got a major promotion to senior analyst, and my mother's response was, "Well, you always were good with numbers," like it was a personality trait I was born with rather than something I'd worked incredibly hard for. Katie's failures were treated like noble quests. My successes were expected, unremarkable, barely worth mentioning. I started calling less, visiting less, building an actual life where I wasn't constantly auditioning for scraps of approval I was never going to get. And then I met David. David was a software engineer with steady hands and this calm, observant way of looking at the world that made me feel seen for the first time in my life. We'd been dating for 3 months when I brought him home for Christmas, and I watched him watch my family with this growing expression of concern that he tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. The dinner where my mother spent 45 minutes talking about Katie's new wellness blog that had 12 followers and exactly 0 minutes asking about the project I'd led that saved my company $2 million. The morning where my mother gave Katie a cashmere sweater and me a generic candle from Home Goods. That night, back at the hotel, David said the quiet part loud. "Your family doesn't see you, Emma." And I don't think it's an accident. I laughed it off, made excuses. That's just how they are. They don't mean anything by it. All the things you say when you've spent your whole life normalizing your own neglect. But David didn't push. He just asked questions that lodged in my brain like splinters. David came into my life 2 years before the wedding, and looking back, I think he knew something was wrong with my family before I even introduced them. I'd mentioned them casually, the way you do, and he'd gotten this look on his face like he was doing mental math that wasn't adding up. But he didn't say anything until he met them himself. That first dinner was at a local restaurant, neutral territory. and I watched David's face cycle through confusion, concern, and something that looked like anger on my behalf as my mother spent 90 minutes asking him about his job, his family, his interests, and exactly 0 minutes asking me anything at all. When Katie showed up 30 minutes late, my mother lit up like someone had plugged her in, and suddenly the table had energy and warmth and laughter that hadn't existed when it was just me. On the drive back, David was quiet for a long time before he finally said, "Your family doesn't see you, Emma. They look right through you." I defended them immediately, instinctively, the way you defend the people who hurt you when you've spent your whole life being told their treatment is normal. That's just how they are. They don't mean anything by it. Mom's just excited about Katie's new job. That's all. David didn't argue. He just nodded and said, "Okay," but I could see him filing it away, adding it to whatever assessment he was building. Over the next few months, he'd ask these careful questions that sounded casual, but weren't. "Does your mom always interrupt you like that? Has Katie always taken credit for your ideas? Why do you apologize so much when you haven't done anything wrong?" He never told me my family was toxic, never gave me ultimatums or demanded I cut contact. He just held up a mirror in the form of gentle questions and let me see my own reflection, my own patterns, the way I'd learned to make myself smaller and quieter and more invisible to accommodate people who wouldn't accommodate me back. It was David who first said the words golden child and scapegoat, who explained that family dysfunction often follows predictable patterns, who validated that, no, I wasn't crazy, and yes, what I'd experienced my entire life actually had a name. He didn't rescue me, he just stood next to me and refused to pretend that what was happening was normal until I couldn't pretend anymore either. David proposed on a hiking trail at sunset, just the two of us, and it was perfect and private and exactly what I wanted, which should have been my first clue that the wedding itself was going to be a nightmare. I called my parents that evening, practically vibrating with happiness, and my mother said, "Oh, that's wonderful, honey," in that bright voice she uses when she's performing enthusiasm, and then, not even 5 seconds later, "Is Katie seeing anyone serious? I keep hoping she'll settle down too." My engagement announcement turned into a speculation session about Katie's love life in under a minute. I should have hung up then. David and I wanted a small wedding, maybe 60 people, close friends and family, intimate and meaningful. I made the mistake of mentioning this to my mother, who immediately announced she'd love to help with planning, which I knew was code for takeover, but I thought maybe this once, she'd actually show up for me. She wanted to invite people I'd never met, her book club friends, my dad's business associates, distant relatives who hadn't spoken to me since I was 12. When I pushed back, said we wanted to keep it small, she hit me with her favorite weapon. "Family is important, Emma. You can't be selfish about this. A wedding isn't just about you. It's about bringing everyone together." A wedding isn't just about me. At my wedding, I tried to set boundaries about the guest list, the venue, the timeline, but my mother had opinions about everything and framed every disagreement as me being difficult or ungrateful. She wanted a say in the flowers, the menu, the seating arrangements. She sent me Pinterest boards of decorations I'd explicitly said I didn't want. She called vendors I'd already booked to just ask questions, which was really code for undermine your decisions, and every time I expressed frustration, she'd sigh and say I was being dramatic, that she was just trying to help, that most daughters would be grateful to have a mother so involved. David watched all of this unfold with increasing alarm and kept gently suggesting that maybe we should just elope, but I was determined to prove something, though I'm not sure what. That I could have one day that was actually about me, that my mother could show up for me the way she showed up for Katie constantly, that I deserved a celebration too. Spoiler alert, I was wrong on all counts. I wanted my best friend Sarah as my maid of honor, the woman who'd been there for me through college, through breakups, through every major moment of my adult life, and when I told my mother this, she actually laughed and said, "Don't be silly, Emma. Katie is your sister. She has to be your maid of honor. It's tradition. I tried to explain that Sarah was more like a sister to me than Katie had ever been, and my mother's face went cold in that way it does when you've crossed a line you didn't know existed, and she said, "You're not excluding your sister from your wedding, that's final." So Katie became my maid of honor. And she treated my wedding planning like it was an audition for a reality show she was starring in. She changed my flower arrangements without asking because roses are overdone, Emma, you need peonies. She told the caterer to swap my menu choices because no one actually likes chicken. Trust me. She redesigned my seating chart because she had a better sense of flow. Every single decision I made, Katie had notes, and my mother backed her up every single time with phrases like, "She has better taste," and "Katie knows what she's doing," and my personal favorite, "Just let her help, Emma. Why do you always have to be so controlling?" I wasn't being controlling. I was trying to have one thing, one day, that reflected what David and I actually wanted. But Katie was treating it like it was her Pinterest board come to life, and I was just the inconvenient bride getting in the way of her vision. David witnessed a particularly brutal planning session where Katie literally told me my dress choice was fine if you want to look frumpy, and my mother nodded sympathetically at Katie, not me. And afterward in the car, David said, "Emma, this is getting worse, we don't have to do this." But I just kept saying I could handle it, it was fine, just a few more months and then it would be over. I was so committed to keeping the peace that I couldn't see I was the only one trying. Katie wasn't trying, Mom wasn't trying. They were steamrolling, and I was calling it compromise because that's what I'd been trained to do my entire life. The dress shopping incident was the moment Sarah stopped being polite about my family, and honestly, I should have listened to her. I found my dress at the third boutique we visited, this beautiful A-line with delicate lace sleeves, and when I put it on, I actually cried because I felt like myself, like the bride I wanted to be, and Sarah was crying too, saying I looked perfect. My mother said it's nice, in that flat voice that means she's underwhelmed, and then Katie, who was supposed to be there to support me, said, "Can I try it on, just to see?" The consultant looked uncomfortable but got her a size, and Katie came out of the dressing room doing a little spin. And I swear to God, my mother's face transformed into actual joy, the kind of expression I'd been chasing my whole life, and she said, "Oh, Katie, you look stunning. This dress was made for you." Katie agreed, naturally, and said she liked it better on herself, and I'm standing there in my jeans feeling like I've been punched, and my mother turned to me and said, "You know, Emma, maybe you should choose something else to avoid comparison. You don't want people thinking Katie looks better in your dress than you do." Sarah, bless her, said, "Are you serious right now?" in a voice that could have stripped paint, and my mother looked offended and said she was just being practical, and Katie said, "I'm not saying I'd wear this exact dress, I'm just saying it works better on my frame." And I felt myself nodding, actually nodding, like this was reasonable feedback instead of the most insane thing that had ever happened. I ended up buying a different dress, one my mother and Katie approved of, one that I liked less, because the alternative was making a scene and being difficult. Sarah didn't speak to my mother or Katie the rest of the day, and when I told David about it later, trying to laugh it off like it was just awkward family dynamics, he put down his coffee and looked at me with something like heartbreak and said, "Emma, this isn't normal. This isn't family. Family doesn't do this." I told him he was overreacting. I think that's when he realized he wasn't dealing with garden variety family drama. He was dealing with something that had roots so deep I couldn't see them anymore. 3 months before the wedding, my mother called and said they wanted to contribute financially because that's what parents do, and I knew it was a trap, but David and I were trying to be generous, trying to include them, so we said sure, even though we'd already paid for everything ourselves. The check arrived with a note, and I should have known better than to open an envelope from my mother without protective gear, because attached to the $3,000 check was a list of conditions. They needed to approve the final guest list. Katie needed meaningful input on all remaining decisions. They wanted to sit down with our wedding planner to discuss the vision. David looked at the check, looked at me, and said, We're not cashing this, but I was already doing the math in my head, the math I'd been doing my whole life, where I try to figure out what I'm worth to my parents in dollar amounts. $3,000. Katie's graduation party, the one I wasn't allowed to help plan because it was her special day, cost $15,000. I know because I overheard my dad on the phone with the caterer. $15,000 for a graduation party for a communications degree she barely scraped by with, versus $3,000 for my wedding, with conditions attached. The generosity was overwhelming. I wanted to tear up the check immediately, mail it back with a note that said, "Keep your guilt money." But David said we should wait, think it through, have a conversation with them about boundaries. Before we could do any of that, my mother called with more demands. She needed +1s added for people I'd specifically said no to. She wanted Katie to give a speech at the reception. She wanted approval rights on my hair and makeup choices because she didn't want to be embarrassed in the photos. Every conversation became a negotiation. Every boundary I tried to set became evidence that I was being difficult and ungrateful, and the $3,000 hung over everything like a sword. Like they'd purchased the right to my wedding with what amounted to pocket change compared to what they'd spent on Katie for literally anything. David kept saying we should give it back, and I kept saying just let me handle it, just let me get through this, and he would look at me with this sadness that I pretended not to understand, because understanding it meant admitting that my family was never going to show up for me the way I needed them to. 1 week before the wedding, my mother informed me, not asked, informed me, that she'd booked the rehearsal dinner venue and would be giving a speech about both her daughters at the reception. And I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone away from my ear and mouthing, "What the fuck?" at David, who was making the same face back at me. I said carefully, "Mom, it's my wedding. Why would you give a speech about Katie?" And she said, "Because I have 2 daughters, Emma, and a wedding is about family. I'm not going to exclude your sister from my toast just because you're the one getting married." The logic was so backward it took me a minute to even formulate a response, and by the time I did, she'd moved on to telling me about the venue she'd booked, a restaurant I'd never heard of, for a rehearsal dinner David and I had already planned at a different location. When I pointed this out, she said she'd already put down a deposit and invited additional guests, people from her side who deserved to be included in the celebration, and I needed to call my venue and cancel. Katie had been spiraling in the days leading up to this, increasingly possessive about every detail, calling me at weird hours to discuss centerpiece arrangements and suggesting changes to the ceremony because I just think it could flow better. Like she was a wedding planner instead of a maid of honor who'd done literally nothing helpful except criticize my choices. I objected to the rehearsal dinner hijacking, said we'd already planned something, already paid a deposit ourselves, and my mother's voice went ice cold, and she said, "You're being ungrateful, Emma. We're trying to help. We're trying to make this wedding special, and all you do is complain." I wasn't complaining. I was trying to have boundaries. But in my family, boundaries and complaints were the same thing, both equally offensive, both signs that I was being selfish and difficult. David overheard this conversation and made a gesture like he was going to take the phone from me and tell my mother exactly what he thought of her help, but I shook my head because I was still, even then, trying to keep the peace, trying to make it to the wedding without a complete family meltdown, not realizing the meltdown was already in progress, and I was the only one who couldn't see it. Wedding morning, I was in the bridal suite with Sarah and my bridesmaids, and my mother was supposed to arrive at 9 to help me get ready, a tradition I'd stupidly thought might be nice, a chance for one good memory before everything went sideways. She showed up at 11, 2 hours late with Katie in tow, and when I asked where she'd been, she said breezily, "Oh, Katie needed help with her dress. You know how important it is that she looks good in the photos." Katie wasn't in the wedding party. Katie was a guest. But sure, her dress was the priority on my wedding day. That tracked. My hair and makeup were already done by the time Mom arrived, professionally, by people I'd hired, and she looked at me with this pinched expression and said, "It's a bit much, don't you think?" and started suggesting changes, reaching for my hair like she was going to undo the stylist's work, and I actually had to step back and say, "Mom, no, I like it how it is." She made a face and said, "Katie would have chosen something more elegant." And that's when David's mom, Patricia, who'd been quietly helping with my dress in the corner, stood up to her full height and said, "Linda, if you can't be supportive, you need to leave. This is Emma's day, and you're making it about yourself." The room went silent. No one talked to my mother like that. No one challenged her, and I watched her face cycle through shock, offense, and then that practiced victim expression she'd perfected over decades. And she said, in a trembling voice, "I'm just trying to help my daughter. I don't know why everyone is attacking me." Patricia didn't back down, just said, "Then help her by being kind." And my mother huffed and went to sit in the corner with Katie, where they whispered to each other and shot looks in my direction, like I was the problem. The tension was so thick you could have cut it with the cake knife I hadn't used yet. And Sarah squeezed my hand and whispered, "You don't have to let them stay." But I did, didn't I? Because they were my parents, and this was my wedding, and I was still operating under the delusion that family meant showing up even when they hurt you. I was so stupid. The ceremony itself went smoothly, if you don't count my mother's face throughout the entire thing, which I can only describe as CBF, cat butt face, like she was sucking on a lemon while simultaneously smelling something rotten, but she kept it together enough that most guests probably didn't notice. David and I said our vows, kissed, walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, and for about 45 minutes I actually felt happy. Like maybe we'd gotten through the worst of it and the reception would just be normal wedding stuff. The cocktail hour was fine, dinner was beautiful, and I started to relax for the first time in weeks as we did our first dance and cut the cake and participated in all the normal wedding activities that people do when their families aren't actively sabotaging them. I should have known better. Katie kept inserting herself into moments that weren't hers, photobombing pictures with me and David, grabbing my arm to pose together when the photographer was trying to get shots of just the bride and groom, laughing too loud and standing too close like she was magnetized to any camera within a 50-foot radius. My mother was right there with her, literally redirecting the photographer's attention, saying things like, "Oh, get one of both my girls," and "Katie, stand here, the light is better," treating my wedding reception like it was a family photo shoot where everyone deserved equal billing. The photographer, bless him, kept trying to politely redirect to me, and my mother kept overriding him, and I watched David's jaw clench tighter and tighter as the evening went on. Then the DJ announced it was time for toasts, and Sarah went first as maid of honor, giving this beautiful, funny speech about our friendship that made me cry. And then David's best man went, and then my mother stood up with her champagne glass, and I felt every muscle in my body tense because I knew, somewhere deep in my gut where all your worst fears live, I knew something bad was about to happen. I just didn't know how bad. My mother stood up with her champagne glass, and the room quieted down the way it does when someone's about to give a toast. And she started with the standard stuff about being a mother, about watching her daughters grow, about how blessed she was. And I started to relax a little because maybe she was going to just do a normal mom toast, and we could all move on with the reception. Then she said, "I'm so blessed to have 2 daughters." And my stomach dropped, because why? Why was she talking about Katie at my wedding toast? And before I could fully process that thought, she hit me with a line that would replay in my head for months. "But I have to be honest, my other daughter is my pride." She was looking directly at Katie when she said it. Not at me, the bride, at my wedding, but at Katie, and the room went so silent I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, this deafening thud that drowned out everything else. I couldn't breathe, literally could not get air into my lungs. David's hand clamped down on mine so hard I thought my fingers might break, and I felt him go rigid beside me, but I couldn't move, couldn't react, couldn't do anything but sit there while my mother continued talking like she hadn't just detonated a bomb at the head table. She went on about Katie's achievements, Katie's strength, Katie's resilience, how proud she was of the woman Katie had become, and guests were shifting in their seats, exchanging horrified looks, and I saw Sarah half standing, like she was going to physically tackle my mother off the microphone. But I was frozen, absolutely frozen, in this moment of public humiliation. My mother finally wrapped up with, "So here's to Emma and David and to family," like she hadn't just spent 3 minutes explaining that her other daughter was the one she actually valued. And when she sat down, she looked pleased with herself, like she'd nailed it, and Katie was smiling, actually smiling, and my dad was staring at his plate, like if he looked hard enough, he could disappear into it. David leaned in close, his voice low and shaking with controlled fury, and whispered 4 words directly into my ear. "We're leaving. Now." I nodded because what else was I going to do? Stay and pretend that was normal? That my mother hadn't just publicly ranked her daughters at my own wedding reception? David and I stood up from the head table and walked out of our own wedding reception without saying a word to anyone, and my parents and Katie followed us outside into the parking lot. My mother's voice shrill and demanding as she yelled, "Where are you going, Emma? Get back here, you're ruining everything." I turned around and just stared at her because the audacity, the absolute audacity of her saying I was ruining everything when she'd just publicly humiliated me at my own wedding. And Katie chimed in with, "This is so typical of you, always so dramatic. It was just a toast, Emma, God." And that's when David, calm, patient, conflict-avoidant David, stepped between me and my family and said in a voice I'd never heard him use before, "No. You don't get to do this anymore." My mother sputtered something about how dare he speak to her that way, and my dad finally found his voice to say, "Let's all just calm down and go back inside." And David said, "We're leaving, and you need to stay away from us." And he put his hand on my back and guided me to our car. My mother was screaming behind us about the money they'd spent, about how ungrateful I was, about how I was tearing the family apart, and Katie was yelling something about me always making everything about myself, and I got into the passenger seat in my wedding dress and just started sobbing, these huge, gasping sobs that I couldn't control. David drove us to our hotel, the one we were supposed to go to after a full night of celebrating, and I couldn't stop crying. Couldn't stop saying, "What just happened? What just happened? Did that really happen?" Over and over, like if I said it enough times it would start making sense. David held me in the hotel room still in his tux, my makeup running down my face, my perfect wedding day destroyed, and he kept saying, "I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." And I kept saying, "Why would she do that? Why would she say that at my wedding?" Like there was an answer that would make it hurt less. There wasn't. The next morning I woke up in the hotel room still wearing my sleep because I'd been too destroyed to fully undress, and David was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, fully clothed, staring at his phone with an expression I couldn't read. I was numb, completely hollowed out, like someone had scooped out my insides and left just a shell, and David was furious in that quiet, dangerous way where you know someone is holding back an explosion. His phone had been buzzing non-stop, message after message, and he'd muted it at some point during the night, but now he was scrolling through them, his face getting darker with every swipe. Most of them were from my mother and Katie, variations on the theme of how I'd overreacted, how I'd embarrassed them, how I needed to apologize, and we all needed to move past this. There was one from my dad, though, separate from the group chat where my mother and Katie were performing their victim routine, just a single message sent at 3 a.m. that said, "I'm sorry. You deserved better. There's something you should know." Attached was a file. David opened it, and I watched the color drain from his face, watched his hands start shaking, watched him go absolutely pale in a way that made my stomach lurch because David didn't get scared, David didn't get shaken, and whatever was in that file had done both. He looked at me, and his voice was rough when he said, "Emma, you need to see this." I sat up, my whole body tensing, and took the phone from him, and my brain couldn't immediately process what I was looking at because It was legal documents, official seals, dates from when I was 3 years old, and the words adoption finalization, and Katie's name, and my parents' names, and it took me several long seconds to understand what I was reading. Katie was adopted. Katie had been adopted when I was 3, and nobody, not my parents, not Katie herself, nobody had ever told me. The documents showed that Katie was adopted when I was 3 years old, which explained why I had zero memory of her arrival, why there were no baby photos of us together, why my entire childhood felt like it started at age 3 with this sister who was just suddenly there. But it wasn't just the adoption, it was who Katie was, the daughter of my mother's sister, my Aunt Claire, who had died in a car accident. Katie was my cousin, adopted and rebranded as my sister. And suddenly, my mother's obsessive favoritism had a name: replacement child syndrome. My mother hadn't just adopted her sister's daughter out of love, she'd adopted a do-over, a second chance to mother her lost sister, and I, the existing daughter, got demoted to make room for this grief project. There were years of paperwork, legal documents, home study reports, court orders, all of it describing how my parents would provide a loving home for Katie, while I was just existing in the background, already born, already there, not special enough to grieve over. At the bottom of the file was a note from my dad, typed out like he couldn't even bring himself to handwrite it. Your mother made me promise to never tell. She said it would confuse you, that it didn't matter, that Katie was your sister now, and that's all you needed to know. I shouldn't have agreed. I've watched her treat you like you were less important your entire life, because to her, Katie represented something she lost, and you were just the child she already had. Katie knows. She's always known. Your mother told her when she was 10. I'm sorry I was too weak to tell you sooner. Everything clicked into place with such sudden clarity that I actually gasped. Every birthday where Katie got more, every achievement of mine that was dismissed while Katie's failures were celebrated, every vacation I was excluded from, every moment I was made to feel like I was asking for too much when I asked for the bare minimum. I wasn't the problem. I was never the problem. I was just the daughter my mother already had before the daughter she actually wanted came along. I called Katie first because I needed to know if my dad was telling the truth, if she'd really known this entire time, and she picked up on the second ring with, "Are you done with your tantrum? Mom's really upset." I said, "Did you know you were adopted?" And there was a pause, and then she said, "Of course I know. I've known since I was 10. What does that have to do with anything?" No surprise, no guilt, just annoyance that I'd found out, and I said, "You knew and you never told me. You watched Mom treat me like garbage for your entire childhood and you just let it happen." And Katie actually laughed and said, "Emma, you were already there. I needed to secure my place. What was I supposed to do? Make myself less important so you'd feel better?" No remorse, not even a little bit. Just this defensive entitlement like she'd done what anyone would do. And when I called her out, said she'd actively participated in my mistreatment, she said, "Oh my God, you're so dramatic. Not everything is about you." And I hung up because there was no point. Katie had chosen herself over me every single day and didn't see a problem with it. I called my mother next, and she was hysterical before I even got a word out, screaming, "Your father had no right to tell you. This is private family business." And I said, "I'm family. Katie's adoption was my business." And she tried to justify it, said, "We gave Katie a home. We were being generous. We were good people taking in a child who needed us." And I said, "And what about the child you already had? What about me?" And she said, like it was obvious, "You had everything already, Emma. You had us. You had a home. Katie needed more." I felt something break inside me, something that had been cracking for years finally shattered, and I said, "You erased my childhood to make room for your grief. You made me invisible so you could pretend Katie was your sister reborn." And my mother said, in that cold voice she uses when she's done pretending to care, "You're being selfish, Emma. Family means sacrifice, and you've never understood that." I hung up, just pressed end call, and sat there holding the phone, and David was watching me with this protective fury, and I realized my mother had just confirmed everything, had admitted she'd sacrificed me for Katie, and thought I should be grateful for it. David and I skipped the honeymoon we'd planned and spent the week holed up in the hotel making a plan. And when we got back to our apartment, the first thing I did was write a letter to my parents setting clear no contact boundaries. No calls, no visits, no emails, no contact through third parties. I was done. I mailed back the $3,000 with interest calculated to the day, along with a note that said, "I don't want your guilt money or your conditions." And then I blocked their numbers, blocked them on every social media platform, blocked Katie too, and felt lighter than I'd felt in years. The flying monkey started almost immediately, extended family members, who my mother had clearly gotten to first, calling and texting to tell me I was overreacting, that family is forever, that I needed to forgive and move on because that's what good daughters do. Some of them I blocked immediately. A few I told the truth to, sent them the adoption documents and a brief explanation. And it was interesting watching them switch sides in real time, suddenly understanding that maybe I wasn't the dramatic problem child my mother had painted me as. My dad sent one more message about a week into the no contact, a long apology where he admitted he was a coward, that he'd failed me, that he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again, but he wanted me to know he was proud of me and sorry for everything. I didn't respond, but I didn't block him either. Just left it in that gray area where it could exist without requiring action from me. Katie sent a few threatening messages about how I'd regret this, how I was tearing the family apart, and then when she realized I wasn't responding, she gave up, probably moved on, to making herself the victim in some other context. 3 months passed. I started therapy. David held my hand through all of it, never once saying "I told you so," even though he absolutely could have. And slowly, I started to feel like a person instead of a wound. 6 months after the wedding that ended with my mother announcing my sister was her pride, and me discovering a 28-year lie, David and I are living in a different state, in a house we bought together, and I'm thriving in a way I didn't know was possible. New job that actually values my work. New friends who don't have decades of context telling them I'm supposed to be the easy, accommodating one. Actual peace. We had Christmas without family obligation for the first time in my life. Just me and David and his parents who've embraced me fully. No drama, no keeping score, no wondering if I'll ever be enough. We made cookies and watched movies, and it was boring and perfect. Sarah visited last month and said I looked different, lighter. Like I'd put down something heavy I'd been carrying so long, I forgot it was there. She was right. I didn't realize how much weight I was carrying until I finally set it down. All those years of trying to earn love from people who decided before I could even remember that I wasn't the daughter worth investing in. I've spent a lot of time in therapy talking about what family should be versus what mine was, and here's what I figured out. Family should be the people who show up for you, who see you, who don't make you audition for basic respect and affection. David's family does that. Sarah does that. My parents never did, and Katie actively participated in my erasure to secure her own position. I'm not an orphan. I'm free. The adoption itself wasn't the betrayal, not really. People adopt kids, families blend and change. That's normal. The betrayal was the decades of lies, the favoritism, the systematic erasure of my worth to prop up Katie as the replacement for my mother's grief. The betrayal was my dad staying silent while I was treated like a supporting character in my own life. The betrayal was Katie knowing the truth and weaponizing it by securing all the love and resources while I got scraps. So Reddit, real question. Did I overreact by cutting them off completely after my mother declared my sister was her pride at my wedding? Or should I have done it years ago? Let me know in the comments.